All right, so let's just remember, I'm trying to find the conclusion of an argument because literally everything that we're doing this semester depends on being able to find the conclusion. Hannah Duncan sees a syllogism in front of her. She needs to find the conclusion. What is the first thing that she does?
I don't know why I'm missing it.
Looks for conclusion words.
She looks for conclusion words like Anna Carmichael.
Consequently, so, therefore, and thus.
Bingo. Therefore, thus, so, and consequently. Hannah Duncan scours this argument for therefore, thus, so, and consequently. She does not find them, but she does not lose hope because next, what does she do, Jackson?
She finds a premise.
A premise word, which is, of course, Wilder, put your mask on. And then others would be what, Vale?
Since, because, for.
Since, because, for, and given that. And once she finds a statement that starts with the premise word, that's the conclusion, right?
No.
No. Where is the conclusion, Jedediah? The statement before the one with the premise word. All right, so here's 1 through 5. Now, the one thing that I noticed that I'm not taking off for today, but I do want to emphasize for you, is that we talked about this yesterday. Only underline the categorical statements. Because all of the window dressing, the therefores, the consequentlies, the since, the because, the for, that's not a part of the categorical statement. Those are just linking words. So when we're writing down major, minor premises and conclusions like we're going to do today, we don't need the linking words. Okay, so what we should have just underlined, for example here, is all calculus problems, not the so all. Some important technology, not the therefore. But I'm going to bless y'all right now. I'm going to give you something that's going to actually save you almost a second of your life many times over. And that is, for those of you who are watching this online, I'm drawing 3 dots in the shape of a triangle. Anybody know what 3 dots in the shape of a triangle means? Sam? Therefore. So when you're writing out arguments, you can just write a little 3-dot triangle right there, and that means therefore you don't have to write the word therefore. Okay? So you're welcome. Save you a little time there. So for all of these, so is a conclusion word, therefore is a conclusion word. Number 3, because is a premise word, so some pagans is our conclusion. Therefore is a conclusion word. Consequently is a conclusion word. 6, 7, and 8. There's no conclusion word for 6, but since is a conclusion word, so some Socratic sages are our conclusion, from which it follows that. Now that's not a normal conclusion word, but from which it follows, that's a pretty good indicator that that is a conclusion. For number 8, thus is a conclusion word, so no racing car is street legal. For number 9, no conclusion word, but for is a premise word, so the first statement is our conclusion. And then for number 10, we must conclude that is our conclusion word. So some pagan literature is not worthless instructional material. Read.
On number 7, all murderers are criminals.
Well, it could be, but it's not in this argument. Like, there's nothing wrong with that sentence. That couldn't be the conclusion, but as it's written, that is not the conclusion of the argument. The conclusion of the argument is from which it follows that some criminals are heroes of the faith. Okay, because that is the terminus of the argument. The author is trying to convince you, trying to prove that some heroes or some criminals are heroes of the faith. So any questions about how to do textbook exercise number 18? Vale?
I think number 5 is a really bad argument.
All marsupials are pouched animals, consequently, and some marsupials are not Australian mammals. Consequently, some Australian mammals are not pouched animals. Yeah, it may be, and you're going to learn how to evaluate that argument in a few days to see if it actually is a bad argument or not.
It's not talking, like, if the second premise is in some marsupials are not Australian mammals, they're trying to figure out if some mammals are, if some Australian mammals are not pouched animals.
Well, Vale clearly has stolen the teacher's edition textbook, and she has looked several lessons ahead, and she's trying to ruin it for all of us by bringing up validity. So, yes, Vale is, you're not wrong, Vale, but we'll get there. I promise. We will get there. How to actually evaluate these arguments and just say, are they weird or are they wrong? But we'll get there in a couple of days. Today, however, we are going to talk about lesson 20, syllogisms. So take out your textbook, open it up to page 147, and you are going to read and highlight or underline or circle, because I'm not giving you a highlighter. So use a pen or a pencil if you want. But read lesson 20 highlighting or circling or marking in some way the answers to your catechism as you go. And then we're going to take some notes on lesson 20.
145.
145, syllogisms. All right, so always helpful to start with some definitions. So when I say syllogism, it's not a word that we use in common conversation too often. A syllogism is a kind of deductive argument. Now, I'm sure that Vale can tell us what deduction is. Vale, can you remind us of what deduction is?
Process of reasoning through premises to
Yes, it's the process of reasoning from premises to a conclusion. Now, remember, we talked about there's two kinds of reasoning. There's deductive reasoning, there's inductive reasoning. We said inductive reasoning is the scientific method. You're making observations and you're putting forward a hypothesis. And the inductive method, inductive reasoning, the scientific method, it only yields probability. All science can tell us is that more than likely it is the case that such and such. Deductive reasoning goes from premises to conclusions, and deductive reasoning yields certainty. So the great thing about a deductive argument is if you construct an argument correctly and your premises are true, then your conclusion is not likely, your conclusion is absolutely certain. That's the value of deductive argument. So a syllogism is a kind of deductive argument made of three statements. Okay, so a syllogism is a deductive argument made up of three statements. You're going to have two premises and a conclusion. So a deductive argument in general could have as many premises as you want. It could have 1,000 premises. It could have one premise. You have as many as you want. A syllogism is a specific kind of deductive argument, and it has three statements, two premises and one conclusion. So for example, here you go. All human beings are eaters of food. All boys are human beings. Therefore, all boys are eaters of food. That is a deductive argument, and it's a syllogism. Remember, a syllogism is a type of deductive argument. So we're going to be working with syllogisms for the rest of this semester. Deductive arguments made up of three statements, two premises, one conclusion. Yes. We'll get to that in a moment. All right, so there's even a specific type of categorical of syllogism. So we're going from deductive arguments. So for those of you who are watching this online, I'm drawing a genus and species chart. The top line of the genus and species chart is deductive arguments. A species or a type of deductive arguments is the syllogism, and then a species of a syllogism is the categorical syllogism. So like the deductive argument, a categorical syllogism is how we do deduction, and it has three statements. What makes a categorical syllogism different than a regular syllogism is all of the statements have to be in categorical form. So that means they're all going to start with what word? What words? Yes, all, no, or some. They're all going to have nouns or noun phrases as the subject and the predicate, and they're all going to have what type of verb? Yeah, a being verb, a verb of being or a to be verb. So in a categorical syllogism, you're going to have three statements, two premises, one conclusion. They're all going to start with all, no, or some. They're all going to have a subject and a predicate that are nouns or noun phrases, and they're all going to have the verb of being. So I'm going to go back one slide here. This is not just a deductive argument. This is not just a syllogism. This is a categorical syllogism. Three statements, two premises, one conclusion. They're all in categorical form. They start with all, no, or some, nouns, noun phrases, verb of being. That's a categorical syllogism. So let's work with the categorical syllogism. You'll notice in categorical syllogisms, they have three premises and three terms. And we call those terms the major term, the minor term, and the middle term. So I'm going to go back yet again. Please note, human beings, so that's term one. Eaters of food, that's term two. And boys, term three. So we've got just three terms in our categorical syllogism. Okay? Major term, middle term, and minor term. And we're going to talk in a second about how to find which one of those is the major, which one of those is the minor, which one of those is the middle. Any questions so far? Or what questions do you have so far? So, nurturing here. What questions do we have so far? Okay, so we're good. Let's move on. So here's that same syllogism again. All human beings are eaters of food. All boys are human beings. Therefore, all boys are eaters of food. So the first thing we got to do is what? What I tell you yesterday, the most important thing to do in this unit is be able to find the conclusion. And I've already got it in order for you with the therefore. So we know that the conclusion is all boys are eaters of food. So the next thing we do is we find the major term. The major term of a syllogism is the predicate of the conclusion. So what's the predicate of this conclusion?
Boys?
The predicate of the conclusion. The whole predicate of the conclusion.
Boys or eaters?
No. Okay, so let's remember something. The subject read is what we're talking about. This statement is talking about boys. The predicate is what we're saying about what we're talking about. And what we're saying about boys is they're eaters of food. So the subject of the conclusion, the predicate of the conclusion is eaters of food. So the major term of a categorical syllogism is the predicate of the conclusion. So if I said to Weaver, what's the major term of this syllogism, you would say what?
Are eaters of food.
Not are, just eaters of food, okay? Just eaters of food. So the major term of a syllogism is the predicate of the conclusion, and it's used in only one premise. So I'm going to repeat this over and over again because this is a process we've got to know like the back of our hand. We find the conclusion. We're going to find the conclusion by looking for a conclusion word, therefore, thus, so, consequently. If we can't find one of those, we're going to look for a premise word, since, because, for, given that. Once we find the conclusion, we find the predicate. And that predicate is our major term. Okay, that is the major term. And you'll notice the major term is only used in one premise. Eaters of food, right there, just being used in one premise. But of course, there is more. So major term is eaters of food. The minor term of a syllogism is the subject of the conclusion. So read, what is the subject of my conclusion? Remember, the subject is what we're talking about. What is the conclusion talking about?
Boys.
Boys. Okay, so the subject of my conclusion is boys, and therefore, that's my minor term. So I've found my conclusion. I have found my major term, and now I know how to find my minor term. So the major term is eaters of food. The minor term is boys. Now that only leaves one term. We got a major term, we got a minor term. The third term is called the middle term, and it is, in this case, human beings. Now, even if you hadn't looked at that yet, Wilder, what would you notice about the term human beings?
So then,
Jackson?
it's not in the conclusion, it's only in the two premises.
Bingo. Okay, not in the conclusion, it's just in the two premises. So again, we found our conclusion. Starts with the word therefore. We have found our major term, it's the predicate. We found our minor term, it's the subject. We found our middle term because it's in both premises, but it's not in the conclusion. So we have now found our conclusion, our major term, our minor term, our middle term. Sally.
Does it say what the minor term is? That's something that's the middle term. That's on the slide.
Say again?
It says, like, what's the minor term? It says,
Oh, well, that's just me if I was asking you. So what's the major term, eaters of food? What's the minor term, boys? And then now I'm talking about the middle term. Yeah, poor formatting. My apologies. So the middle term, major term, minor term. So what questions do we have about major term, middle term, minor term? Okay, so we've got a categorical syllogism. It's a syllogism made up of three statements in categorical form. We've got one conclusion. We've got two premises. We've got a major term, a minor term, and a middle term. So that's what we got so far. So we're feeling good about what we got so far, right? Okay, let's go on to the next thing. All right, same syllogism. All human beings are eaters of food. All boys are human beings. Therefore, all boys are eaters of food. So we've got two premises in each categorical syllogism. There's a major premise and a minor premise, and it's as simple as it sounds. You might be sitting here thinking, oh God, I hope major is the one with the major term, and your prayers have been answered. That's exactly what it is. Okay, the major premise has the major term. So our major term is eaters of food. So which one of these is our major premise? 1 or 2? Bean?
1.
1, yeah. Eaters of food is in the top one. So that's our major premise. We found our major term. That's where our major premise is. Or that's where our major term will be located, in the major premise. So the major premise is the premise containing the major term. So let's take a wild stab, Drake. What do you think the minor premise is?
Minor term.
Yes, it's the one containing the minor term. And good news, sports fans, there's no middle premise. Okay? We found our major term, we found our minor term, we found our middle term, which means we know where our major premise is, we know where our minor premise is, and there's not a middle premise. And so we're pretty much done with one thing left to do. We got to put it in the right order. Okay, we got to put it in the right order. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So turn to page 146 in your textbooks. Look at page 146. And avoid the temptation to look down at the bottom, which will tell you the answers. Jesus is watching, so just do your best to just look at the syllogism. Here you go. I'm going to read it to you. It says this. All ringed planets are gas giants, so no inner planets are ringed planets, since no inner planets are gas giants. Now we know, since I said it to you 17 times yesterday, the first thing you got to do is find the conclusion. Vale, what is the conclusion of that argument?
No inner planets are ringed planets.
You are so smart. Vale, how did you know that?
Because it starts with the word so.
It starts with the word so, which is one of our conclusion words. So the conclusion is no inner planets are ringed planets. Step 2 of our little process is find the major term. Hannah Duncan, what is the major term? Remember, the major term is the predicate. Sorry, you're go ahead.
Ring planets.
Ringed planets, because Hannah Duncan knows the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. So our major term is ringed planets. Step 3, find the major premise. Jackson?
It's the first premise.
The first premise. All ringed planets are gas giants, correct? Process of elimination here, David Sellers. What's my minor premise? Yeah, no inner planets are gas giants. So there are 2 ways. If I ask you on a test or a quiz, how do you find the minor premise? There's 2 possible answers. There's 2 ways. 1, it has the minor term. But even more basic,
Find the major.
yeah, find the major one. It's the process of elimination. It's not the conclusion. It's not the major premise. There's only 3, so it's the last one left, okay? So you find the conclusion, you find the major term, you find the major premise, you find the minor premise, and then you put it in standard order. Standard order, henceforth, if I say standard order, major, minor, conclusion. That is the standard order for a categorical syllogism. Major, minor, conclusion, okay? Major, minor, conclusion. So that's what I told you yesterday, guys. I hope you can see literally everything you're going to do for the rest of this unit depends on you being able to do step 1. If you can't find the conclusion, you're not going to be able to find the major term, the minor term, the middle term, the major premise. Like the whole thing goes wrong. And so we've got to be very careful. We're looking for therefore, thus, so, or consequently. And if we can't find that, we're looking for because, since, for, given that. And that's how we find our conclusion. So a lot of information. Sally Dixon, question?
So the standard order is major, minor, conclusion?
Yes, ma'am.
Notice you don't include middle.
Remember, there is no middle premise. There's only a middle term. And the middle term will be in both of those premises. That was just you, Johnson pencil. Okay. Hannah?
Why don't we do minor term?
Why don't we find the minor term? Because it's really just, it would be redundant. Because like we said, if you found the major term and you found the major premise and you found the conclusion, then they're assuming that you know the minor term, that kind of process elimination. So if you want to have in your head like a little step 3.1 or 3.2, find the minor term before we go on, that's fine. But really, you're just kind of process of elimination. Any other questions? Or what questions do we have about categorical syllogisms, major, minor, or middle term, major, minor premise, and conclusion? Okay, let's do a little practice. So go to page 149 in your book. Yes, sir. Thank you, guys. Okay, so 1 through 5 have the same instructions. It says, identify the major, minor, and middle terms for each syllogism. The syllogisms are not necessarily in standard order. Okay, so let's look at number 1. What is the conclusion of number 1? Sellers?
All calculus problems are theology.
Now, this is in the instructions, but I think it would be wise for you to do this. I want you to go ahead and circle the conclusion. Okay, so in your textbook, circle the conclusion right now. So remember, just the categorical statement, all calculus problems are theology. Circle the conclusion in your textbook. Sally, have you circled the conclusion already? We're on page 149. We're looking at number 1, and you are circling all calculus problems are theology. Jackson? Sure, if you want to underline. I'm not grading that. I'm just telling you it's going to be a good habit for you to visually clue yourself in. This is the conclusion. All right, so the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. So Wilder, what is the major term of number 1?
Major term would be.
Have you circled the conclusion, Wilder? Okay, so the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. So theology. So the major term is theology. Okay, the minor term is what, Sam?
The minor term is a
Calculus problems. And so, Jackson, process elimination, what is the middle term?
In infinity.
Study in infinity. Okay, so for number 1, major term is theology, minor term, calculus problems, middle term, study in infinity. Okay, so you're going to find the conclusion, find the major term, find the minor term, find the middle term. Any questions about how to do 1 through 5 in your textbook? Hannah?
Why do we circle the letter
Need to.
I'm having you circle the conclusion because all the questions are based on you finding the conclusion. So I think it's just a good little visual reminder of like, this is what I'm looking at. This is what I need to find.
Yeah, just
Okay.
Yeah, it's not, I'm not grading whether you circle or not. I'm just telling you, for me, I always did that when I was doing these. I would just circle the conclusion because like that's what I got to find first. And that helps me keep it straight in my mind. Okay, look over on the next page, 6 through 10. It says, rewrite the following arguments into standard order for categorical syllogisms. What is standard order? Fail?
Major term, major premise, minor premise, and then.
Yes, major, minor, conclusion. Major, minor, conclusion. Okay, so for numbers 6 through 10, you're going to find the conclusion, and that will obviously go on the third line. But remember, you don't have to write therefore. You can just write the 3 little triangles. So let's do number 6 together. Someone tell me the conclusion of number 6. Sellers?
Socratic sages are not perspicacious people.
Yes, and guys, feel free to use your graded homework on this. You don't have to refine the conclusion. You already did it. So use your graded homework. Okay, so the conclusion that you're going to write on the third line is you're going to write your three-dot triangle, and you're going to write, some Socratic sages are not perspicacious people. Now we're going to find the major term. What is the major term of the conclusion? Jackson?
It is perspicacious people.
Perspicacious people. And so what is the major premise, Anna Carmichael? What is the major premise of this argument?
Oh, major premise?
Yeah.
Some, whatever that word is, people are also known.
Yes, some perspicacious people are metaphorical masters. Process elimination, what's the minor premise? Vale?
Some Socratic sages are metaphorical masters.
Yes, so on the first line, you're going to write some perspicacious people are metaphorical masters. The second line, some Socratic sages are metaphorical masters. The third line, therefore, some Socratic sages are not perspicacious people. Okay? So that's our homework. Any questions about 6 through 10? All right, let me give you your homework. Hannah, sorry, go ahead.
I'm confused.
Okay.
So on number 6, you write some Socratic sages are not whatever people. You write that on the last line?
Yes, because that's the conclusion. You remember, you always find the conclusion first. So you write that first because that's the conclusion. So you find that first.
Do you write on the first line? Or
The last line. Remember, major, minor, conclusion. The order is major, minor, conclusion. We have found the conclusion, and so we're writing it on the bottom line.
But then how do you know there's like the major and minor one?
What?
How do you know the difference between the major and the minor?
Socratic sages, so the minor is the subject, the major is the predicate. That's not right, minor is subject.
Yeah, yeah. It's
So
always like
classification
that.
people.
The subject is always the minor.
The major premise is the ones with first